The air over the Ruhr pocket in April 1945 did not smell of spring. It tasted of pulverized masonry, cordite, and the sickly sweet rot of a collapsing empire. In a makeshift lazarette tucked into the cellar of a partially collapsed gymnasium, the flickering yellow light of tallow candles cast long, dancing shadows against walls damp with seepage. This was the twilight of the Third Reich, a world shrinking until it was nothing more than the radius of a guttering flame. Sister Martha, a veteran of the nursing corps who had seen the sunflowers of the Ukraine and the white hell of Stalingrad, wiped a bead of cold sweat from her forehead with the back of a hand stained gray by charcoal dust. Before her lay a young grenadier, his chest heaving with the shallow, rhythmic desperation of the dying. The silence in the cellar was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic thud of distant artillery, the American drumfire that had become the heartbeat of their retreat. For months, the German medical staff had operated in a state of managed catastrophe. The supply lines were no longer lines, they were severed threads. There were no more glass ampoules of morphine, no more clean rolls of gauze, and, most crucially, the fine silk and catgut used for closing wounds had vanished weeks ago. They were using treated paper twine and reclaimed string, materials that snapped under tension or festered within the flesh of the men they tried to save. Martha looked at her tray. It held a single rusted scalpel and a bowl of murky water. The scarcity was not just a logistical failure. It was a psychological weight that pressed down on every nurse in the room, a physical manifestation of a nation being hollowed out from within. Outside, the world was ending in a cacophony of steel. The German soldiers remaining in the pocket were shadows among ruins, fighting for a cause that had transitioned from conquest to mere survival. The nurses had been told for years that the Americans were a soft people, a decadent collection of disparate cultures held together only by greed, who would crumble when faced with the iron will of the fatherland. Yet, as the rumble of Sherman tanks grew loud enough to vibrate the surgical instruments on Martha's tray, the irony was thick. The iron will was currently out of bandages, while the decadent enemy was bringing a deluge of fire and metal that seemed to have no end. The transition from the old world to the new happened at exactly 9 o'clock hours. The heavy wooden doors at the top of the gymnasium stairs were not blown open, but kicked, the wood splintering with a sharp, definitive crack. The German guards, boys no older than 16 with uniforms 3 sizes too large, dropped their Mausers onto the concrete. The sound of the rifles hitting the floor was the final punctuation mark on a 1,000-year dream. Through the dust and the hazy shafts of morning light, the first American infantrymen appeared. They did not look like the monsters portrayed in the propaganda film shown in Berlin. They looked like giants, wrapped in high-quality wool and heavy canvas, their pockets bulging with mysterious riches, their movements fluid and strangely casual. As the Americans filed into the dim cellar, Martha and the other nurses stood paralyzed. They had been briefed on the protocols of capture, the expected interrogations, the potential for maltreatment, the cold reality of becoming spoils of war. They braced for the bitterness of the vanquished. Instead, they were met with a sensory overload of American presence. The GIs didn't just bring weapons, they brought an atmosphere of kinetic energy and inexplicable cleanliness. One soldier, a medic with a red cross painted crudely on his helmet, stepped forward. He didn't shout. He didn't point a weapon. He looked at the dying grenadier on the table, then at the meager, blood-crusted tools in Martha's hands, and let out a long, low whistle of disbelief. The contrast was staggering. The German nurses, in their frayed, unwashed uniforms, stood as relics of a regime that had prioritized the machine over the man. The Americans, even in the grit of combat, exuded a sense of being part of a system that valued the individual's recovery. The medic reached into a side pouch and pulled out a small, waterproof packet. With a flick of his wrist, he tore it open, revealing a pristine, white bandage, more cotton than Martha had seen in a year. The smell of antiseptic filled the room, sharp and clean, cutting through the stench of the cellar like a blade. It was the first sign that the war they had been fighting was not the one they were currently entering. The nurses watched, their eyes wide and mouths dry, as the Americans began to systematically transform their tomb of a hospital into something else entirely. The occupation had begun, but it did not feel like a conquest. It felt like a collision with a future they were not prepared to understand. The surrender was not a climax of shouting and steel, but a heavy, rhythmic shifting of weight. As the American infantry secured the perimeter of the gymnasium, the German nurses were ushered into the courtyard. The April sun was blindingly bright, a cruel contrast to the subterranean gloom they had occupied for weeks. Sister Martha squinted against the glare, her hands instinctively clutching the edges of her apron. Around her, the younger nurses trembled, their faces pale masks of exhaustion and indoctrination. They had been fed a steady diet of stories regarding the Amos, that they were vengeful, that they would treat German women as trophies of war, and that their lack of discipline would lead to a descent into animalistic chaos. Instead, they encountered a terrifyingly efficient machine. The American soldiers moved with a relaxed, almost nonchalant precision that the Germans found profoundly unsettling. There was no goose-stepping, no screaming of orders, yet the courtyard was transformed within minutes. Jeeps skidded to a halt, their engines idling with a deep, healthy growl that spoke of limitless fuel, a sound the Germans hadn't heard from their own parched logistics in years. The nurses were lined up against a brick wall, still pockmarked from the morning's skirmish. Martha watched a young American private leaning against a fender, casually peeling an orange. The scent of the citrus, sharp and sweet, drifted across the yard. It was a sensory insult to the starving women. The idea that a frontline soldier possessed fresh fruit was a more devastating blow to their morale than any artillery barrage. The fear among the nurses was a physical presence, a cold coil in the gut. They waited for the expected brutalities. They watched as American officers, their uniforms made of fine, heavy twill, consulted maps and spoke into radio handsets that hummed with clear, static-free voices. The German medical personnel were a ragged contrast, unwashed, sallow-skinned, and draped in the gray, thinning fabrics of a collapsing economy. To the nurses, this was the harvest of steel. They were the gleanings of a field that had been threshed by the most industrial military force in human history. Every American belt was heavy with pouches. Every soldier seemed to carry more gear than a German squad could muster. A tall lieutenant with a silver bar on his helmet approached the group. He didn't reach for a pistol. Instead, he pulled a pack of Lucky Strike cigarettes from his pocket and offered one to the head doctor, who stood at the end of the line. The doctor, a man who had spent the last 3 days amputating limbs with a carpenter's saw, took the cigarette with trembling fingers. The lieutenant produced a metal lighter, a Zippo, and flicked it open with a metallic clink that echoed in the quiet courtyard. The flame was steady, unflickering. In that small light, Martha saw the reflection of a truth they had all been denied. The enemy was not a desperate mob of mercenaries, but a titan of industry that could afford to be casual in the face of total victory. The processing of the prisoners began with a clinical detachment that was almost more frightening than anger. The Americans began to sort the medical staff, separating the doctors and nurses from the combatant prisoners. There was no shouting, no bayonet prodding. When a young nurse named Elsa began to sob, overcome by the sheer tension of the unknown, an American medic reached into his pocket. The nurses flinched, expecting a weapon or a blow. Instead, the soldier held out a small, rectangular bar wrapped in bright, crinkling foil. He gestured for her to take it. It was chocolate, dense, rich, and smelling of a world that existed before the war had turned everything to ash. As they were loaded into the back of a deuce-and-a-half truck, Martha looked back at the gymnasium. The building was a ruin, a tomb for the ideology they had served. The harvest was complete. They were being hauled away from the front, away from the familiar misery of the Reich, and into the belly of the American beast. They expected a labor camp or a cage. They expected the primitive Americans to show their true colors. But as the truck lurched forward, Martha noticed the tires were made of thick, new rubber, biting into the mud of the German road with a grip that seemed to defy the very collapse of the world. They were not just prisoners of a military. They were prisoners of a civilization that possessed more of everything: food, fuel, medicine, and silk than they had ever been permitted to imagine. The terror of the unknown was being slowly replaced by a burgeoning, silent awe at the sheer material weight of their captors. The journey from the ruins of the Ruhr to the American rear was a blur of motion over roads that should have been impassable. The German nurses huddled together in the truck bed, watching through the slats as a seemingly endless stream of olive-drab vehicles flowed past them in the opposite direction. It was a river of steel, trucks, tanks, and ambulances, all moving with a mechanical confidence that signaled the end of the world they knew. When the convoy finally slowed, they did not pull into a barbed wire enclosure or a grim stone fortress. Instead, they crested a gentle rise to see a sprawling city of canvas rising from a muddy German meadow. This was the U.S. Army Evacuation Hospital, a cathedral of canvas that defied the very nature of a frontline war zone. To Martha and her sisters, who had spent years operating in damp cellars and bombed-out railway stations, the sight was hallucinatory. Hundreds of massive tents were aligned with geometric precision, their peaked roofs casting long, sharp shadows in the afternoon light. The air here didn't smell of decay. It hummed with the steady, subterranean throb of massive portable generators. For the first time in years, the nurses heard the sound of a society that had conquered the darkness. As they were led off the trucks, the sensory shock deepened. The Americans had laid down wooden duckboards to create a network of clean walkways over the churning spring mud. Strung between the tents were actual electric wires, and even in the daylight, the faint glow of incandescent bulbs could be seen through the canvas flaps. To the German eye, accustomed to the flickering candle and the oil lamp, this was a display of godlike power. The Americans weren't just fighting a war. They were transplanting a modern, electrified civilization directly onto the battlefield. Martha touched the canvas of a supply tent as she passed. The fabric was heavy, waterproof, and brand new. They were ushered into a central receiving area where the scale of American logistics became an undeniable fact. Large wooden crates were stacked like monuments, stenciled with bold letters: penicillin, morphine, ether, sulfa. There was no dust on these boxes, no signs of the frantic, piecemeal scavenging that defined the German medical corps. A young American corporal, clipboard in hand, directed them toward a decontamination and processing station. He didn't look at them with hatred, but with a distracted sort of efficiency, as if they were simply more units to be cataloged in a vast, winning ledger. Inside the processing tent, the nurses were instructed to wash. They were handed bars of ivory soap, pure white and buoyant, and towels that were thick and thirsty. The water was hot, piped in from a portable boiler that hissed nearby. As the grime of the Ruhr was scrubbed away, the psychological armor of the nurses began to soften. In the Reich, scarcity had been framed as a virtue, a test of racial will. Here, the abundance was so casual it felt like an insult to their sacrifice. They watched through the open flap of the tent as a forklift, a machine none of them had ever seen, effortlessly moved a pallet of rations. The most jarring realization was the lack of tension in the American personnel. Doctors walked with their hands in their pockets, whistling tunes that sounded like the jazz the Ministry of Propaganda had banned as degenerate. There was no fear of the sky, no scanning for the silhouette of an enemy plane. The Americans owned the air as surely as they owned the earth beneath their boots. Martha looked at her fellow nurses, Elsa, Greta, and the others, and saw the same haunting thought reflected in their eyes. They had been told the Americans were a people without a soul, yet these soulless people had built a sanctuary of light and heat in the middle of a wasteland. The Cathedral of Canvas was not just a hospital, it was a temple to a philosophy of plenty that made the German struggle look like a tragedy of unnecessary deprivation. They were no longer just captives, they were witnesses to an industrial miracle. The sensory transition from the Cathedral of Canvas into the operational heart of the hospital was marked by a scent that Martha had long ago forgotten: the clinical, biting sharpness of high-grade isopropyl alcohol. As the nurses were assigned to a preparatory tent, they were confronted with the American smell of plenty. It was a fragrance composed of chemical purity, roasted coffee, and the metallic tang of sterilized instruments. This was the headquarters of a medical corps that did not need to boil bandages for a third time or scrape the rust from a dull needle. On a long, folding table in the center of the tent sat a wooden crate, its lid pried open to reveal hundreds of small, translucent glass jars. Martha stepped closer, her breath catching in her throat. Inside each jar, submerged in a preserving fluid, was a spool of jet-black silk. This was the recurring symbol of their new reality, the suture spool. In the German army, silk was a luxury reserved for the high command or the most elite surgical units. By 1945, it had been replaced by coarse horsehair or synthetic threads that tore through delicate tissue. Here, it was presented in a volume that seemed obscene. The German nurses watched as an American orderly reached into the crate, grabbed a handful of the jars, and tossed them into a tray with a casualness that bordered on the sacrilegious. To Martha, those jars represented a king's ransom in medical security. To the American, they were merely a Tuesday. The orderly noticed the nurses staring and, with a shrug, pulled a single spool from his pocket and held it out to Elsa. The young nurse took it with trembling hands, turning the glass jar over in the light. The silk was perfectly uniform, a continuous, unbroken thread of democratic industrial might. This abundance created a profound cognitive dissonance. For years, the German state had preached that strength through joy was found in sacrifice and the hardening of the spirit against want. Yet, standing in the glow of electric lanterns, surrounded by crates of suture silk that reached the ceiling, the nurses could see that the American spirit had not been softened by its riches. Instead, it had been empowered. The wasteful Americans used a new, sterile needle for every injection. They discarded bandages after a single use. They did not conserve, they replaced. The nurses were directed to begin sorting instruments, a task designed to test their competence and familiarize them with American equipment. As Martha handled the hemostats and forceps, she noticed they were made of high-quality stainless steel, gleaming and free of the pitting common in the late-war German substitutes. Every time she looked up, she saw more of the silk spools. They were everywhere, on every surgical tray, in every medic's pouch, stacked in the corners like common bricks. The sound of the hospital was the sound of this plenty, the snip-snip of scissors cutting through miles of fresh gauze and the clink of glass jars being opened. It was a rhythmic, industrial pulse that signaled a change in the nurses' internal ideology. They had been taught that the individual was a gear in a great machine, to be used until worn and then discarded. But as they watched the Americans prepare to treat the evening's influx of casualties, both American and German, using the same high-quality silk and the same sterile techniques for everyone, the nurses began to realize a deeper truth. The abundance of the spool was not just about material wealth, it was about the value placed on a single human life. The American waste was, in reality, a refusal to compromise on the recovery of the wounded. The silk was the thread that would begin to sew their shattered world back together, one stitch at a time. Inside the processing tent, the nurses were instructed to wash. They were handed bars of ivory soap, pure white and buoyant, and towels that were thick and thirsty. The water was hot, piped in from a portable boiler that hissed nearby. As the grime of the roar was scrubbed away, the psychological armor of the nurses began to soften. In the Reich, scarcity had been framed as a virtue, a test of racial will. Here, The abundance was so casual it felt like an insult to their sacrifice. They watched through the open flap of the tent as a forklift, a machine none of them had ever seen, effortlessly moved a pallet of rations. The most jarring realization was the lack of tension in the American personnel. Doctors walked with their hands in their pockets, whistling tunes that sounded like the jazz the Ministry of Propaganda had banned as degenerate. There was no fear of the sky, no scanning for the silhouette of an enemy plane. The Americans owned the air as surely as they owned the earth beneath their boots. Martha looked at her fellow nurses, Elsa, Greta, and the others, and saw the same haunting thought reflected in their eyes. They had been told the Americans were a people without a soul, yet these soulless people had built a sanctuary of light and heat in the middle of a wasteland. The Cathedral of Canvas was not just a hospital, it was a temple to a philosophy of plenty that made the German struggle look like a tragedy of unnecessary deprivation. They were no longer just captives. They were witnesses to an industrial miracle. The sensory transition from the Cathedral of Canvas into the operational heart of the hospital was marked by a scent that Martha had long ago forgotten, the clinical, biting sharpness of high-grade isopropyl alcohol. As the nurses were assigned to a preparatory tent, they were confronted with the American smell of plenty. It was a fragrance composed of chemical purity, roasted coffee, and the metallic tang of sterilized instruments. This was the headquarters of a medical corps that did not need to boil bandages for a third time or scrape the rust from a dull needle. On a long, folding table in the center of the tent sat a wooden crate, its lid pried open to reveal hundreds of small, translucent glass jars. Martha stepped closer, her breath catching in her throat. Inside each jar, submerged in a preserving fluid, was a spool of jet-black silk. This was the recurring symbol of their new reality, the suture spool. In the German army, silk was a luxury reserved for the high command or the most elite surgical units. By 1945, it had been replaced by coarse horsehair or synthetic threads that tore through delicate tissue. Here, it was presented in a volume that seemed obscene. The German nurses watched as an American orderly reached into the crate, grabbed a handful of the jars, and tossed them into a tray with a casualness that bordered on the sacrilegious. To Martha, those jars represented a king's ransom in medical security. To the American, they were merely a Tuesday. The orderly noticed the nurses staring and, with a shrug, pulled a single spool from his pocket and held it out to Elsa. The young nurse took it with trembling hands, turning the glass jar over in the light. The silk was perfectly uniform, a continuous, unbroken thread of democratic industrial might. This abundance created a profound cognitive dissonance. For years, the German state had preached that strength through joy was found in sacrifice and the hardening of the spirit against want. Yet, standing in the glow of electric lanterns, surrounded by crates of suture silk that reached the ceiling, the nurses could see that the American spirit had not been softened by its riches. Instead, it had been empowered. The wasteful Americans used a new, sterile needle for every injection. They discarded bandages after a single use. They did not conserve, they replaced. The nurses were directed to begin sorting instruments, a task designed to test their competence and familiarize them with American equipment. As Martha handled the hemostats and forceps, she noticed they were made of high-quality stainless steel, gleaming and free of the pitting common in the late-war German substitutes. Every time she looked up, she saw more of the silk spools. They were everywhere, on every surgical tray, in every medic's pouch, stacked in the corners like common bricks. The sound of the hospital was the sound of this plenty, the snip-snip of scissors cutting through miles of fresh gauze and the clink of glass jars being opened. It was a rhythmic, industrial pulse that signaled a change in the nurses' internal ideology. They had been taught that the individual was a gear in a great machine, to be used until worn and then discarded. But as they watched the Americans prepare to treat the evening's influx of casualties, both American and German, Using the same high-quality silk and the same sterile techniques for everyone, the nurses began to realize a deeper truth. The abundance of the spool was not just about material wealth. It was about the value placed on a single human life. The American waste was, in reality, a refusal to compromise on the recovery of the wounded. The silk was the thread that would begin to sew their shattered world back together, one stitch at a time. The transition from observers to participants was precipitated by the arrival of the Red Ball Express, the massive American supply trucks that, on this evening, were preceded by a frantic line of ambulances. A major breakthrough at the front had resulted in a surge of casualties that overwhelmed the immediate capacity of the American surgical teams. The language of anatomy, universal and cold, suddenly superseded the barriers of language and the status of prisoner. A harried American major, his surgical gown already splattered with the dark crimson of venous blood, looked at the German nurses and barked a single word: scrub. Martha and her team moved with a reflexive discipline that years of war had etched into their bones. As they stood at the outdoor basins, using actual surgical soap that lathered into a thick, disinfecting foam, the friction between the two sides began to dissolve in the face of necessity. Inside the main surgical tent, the atmosphere was one of controlled chaos. The smell of ether was thick enough to taste, and the electric lights hummed with a steady, reassuring vibration. The German nurses were assigned to assist American surgeons, acting as third hands in a dance they knew by heart, yet performed here with entirely different tools. Initially, there was a palpable tension. The American surgeons worked with a brisk, almost aggressive speed, their movements unburdened by the fear of running out of supplies. Martha stood across from a young captain who was debriding a shrapnel wound in a GI's thigh. When she reached for a pair of forceps, their hands brushed, and she saw the momentary flash of suspicion in his eyes, the realization that the woman assisting him had, until 24 hours ago, been the enemy. But as she clamped an artery with perfect precision, the suspicion faded into a professional nod. In the theater of the wounded, there was no room for politics. There was only the common enemy of hemorrhage and infection. The German nurses struggled to adapt to the American rhythm. They were used to a culture of extreme conservation, saving every scrap of metal, every inch of thread. When Elsa tried to save a slightly soiled dressing, the American nurse beside her shook her head and threw it into a waste bin, handing her a fresh, sterile pack. It was a clash of philosophies. To the Germans, the American method looked like recklessness. To the Americans, the German method looked like a death sentence for the patient. As the night wore on, the language of anatomy became the only dialogue that mattered. Martha watched the American surgeons utilize the massive quantities of penicillin at their disposal, injecting the miraculous mold juice with a frequency that seemed magical. They were witnessing a level of care that the German medical corps had once dreamed of, but had long since abandoned in the name of total war. The nurses realized that while they had been taught to maintain the health of the Volk, the Americans were focused on the survival of the individual man on the table. By the early hours of the morning, the distinction between the captors and the captives had blurred. The German nurses were no longer just prisoners. They were an essential component of the hospital's life-saving machinery. They were speaking the same dialect of sutures, clamps, and debridement. The friction was still there, a low-level hum of cultural difference, but it was being smoothed over by the shared labor of repair. As Martha tied off a bleeder under the direction of an American doctor, she realized that the shared professional bond was the first bridge they had crossed. The war had not ended, but in this canvas cathedral, the ideology of hate was being systematically dismantled by the practical necessity of mercy. The surge of casualties from the collapsing front did not discriminate between the victor and the vanquished, and neither did the operating tables of the American evacuation hospital. By the third night, the German nurses were no longer merely assistants. They were being integrated into the front line of the surgical effort. It was during a particularly grueling shift, under the unwavering glare of the electric surgical lamps, that the most profound transformation occurred. Martha was stationed across from a major named Miller, a man whose hands moved with the rhythmic certainty of a master clockmaker. Between them lay a young man, a German prisoner whose abdomen had been shredded by mortar fragments. In the German field hospitals, a wound of this magnitude was often a death sentence, not because of a lack of skill, but because of a lack of the necessary materials to perform a delicate, time-consuming repair. Major Miller reached for a jar of the black silk suture. With a quick, practiced motion, he broke the seal and drew out a length of the thread. He looked at Martha, noting the way her eyes followed the silk with a mix of reverence and longing. Instead of completing the stitch himself, he paused and held out the needle driver to her. It was a silent command, a lesson in silk that bypassed the need for a translator. Martha hesitated. The hierarchy of the German medical system was rigid and patriarchal. Nurses assisted. They did not lead the closing of major incisions. But Miller nodded firmly, gesturing toward the gaping wound. Martha took the instrument. The needle was sharp, the steel of a quality that felt alien in her gloved hand. As she began to work, Miller began to guide her, not with words, but by tapping the tissue to indicate a specialized American tension suturing technique, a method designed to reduce scarring and prevent the wound from reopening under the strain of transport. This was the moment the war changed for Martha. The silk did not snap. It was supple and strong, sliding through the flesh with minimal resistance. As she worked, she realized she was being taught a secret of American success. It wasn't just that they had more silk, it was that they had developed better ways to use it because they had the luxury of innovation. In the Reich, innovation had been stifled by the desperate need to find substitutes for everything. Here, the focus was entirely on the perfection of the craft. Miller watched her, his eyes crinkling above his mask in a way that suggested a smile. He was treating her not as a prisoner of a defeated race, but as a fellow practitioner of the healing arts. The lesson was more than technical. As Martha completed the row of perfect, uniform stitches, she felt a crack in the foundation of her world. Every stitch was a rejection of the propaganda that had defined her adult life. If the Americans were the barbarians she had been told they were, why were they spending this precious, high-quality silk on a nameless German corporal? Why were they taking the time to teach her, a prisoner, how to better save the lives of her own countrymen? The lesson in silk revealed a terrifying truth. The Americans were winning because their system allowed them to be kind. Their abundance gave them the freedom to value the individual, even an individual who had been trying to kill them only hours before. When the final knot was tied, Miller took the scissors and snipped the excess silk, letting the small, dark remnants fall away like the discarded remnants of the old world. He patted Martha's hand briefly, a gesture of professional respect that felt like a bolt of lightning, and moved to the next table. Martha stood for a moment, looking down at the neat, black lines she had created on the soldier's skin. The suture was a bridge of silk, connecting the German girl to the American doctor and the dying boy to a future he hadn't expected to see. The symbol of abundance had become a tool of education, and the ideology of the master race was being quietly unraveled, one perfect stitch at a time. The integration of the German nurses into the hospital's daily rhythm brought them face to face with a reality that no amount of Berlin radio broadcasts could explain away. This was the war of ideology versus penicillin, a confrontation where the abstract promises of a 1,000-year empire crumbled against the tangible, life-saving miracles of a laboratory in Peoria or Brooklyn. Every morning, the nurses watched the American orderlies distribute the yellow magic, the vials of penicillin, with a frequency that seemed to defy the laws of scarcity. The internal conflict was most visible in Elsa, the youngest of the group. She had been raised entirely within the shadow of the Reich, her worldview constructed from the idea that resources belonged only to those with the will to power. One afternoon, she stood frozen in the recovery ward, watching an American medic administer a dose of the rare antibiotic to a German non-commissioned officer who had arrived with a gangrenous leg. Elsa knew that in a German lazaret, this man would have been left to die or subjected to a crude amputation to save the dwindling supply of basic sulfa powder. Yet here, the Americans were wasting their most precious medicine on a man who wore the Iron Cross. This clinical impartiality was a psychological mortar shell. The nurses saw that the Americans did not ask for a patient's political pedigree before opening a sterile pack of gauze. The abundance of the United States was not a weapon used to bribe, but a tool used to stabilize. They watched the GIs share their K-rations with wounded prisoners, handing over tins of ham and eggs and packets of sugar as if hunger were a technical problem that needed solving rather than a condition of defeat. To the nurses, who had seen their own people starved in the name of the total war effort, this casual generosity was more intimidating than any tank. It suggested a society so wealthy and so secure in its values that it could afford to be merciful to its enemies. The contrast between the two ideologies was sharpened by the recurring sight of the suture spool. On the German side, every inch of thread was accounted for, rationed with a desperate, parsimonious grip that reflected the thinning blood of the Reich. On the American side, the silk was used with a focused intensity on the patient's recovery, then discarded without a second thought for the cost. The nurses began to realize that the German ideology had been one of either either the state survives or the individual dies. The American ideology, manifested in the endless crates of supplies, was both and the individual survives so the state can flourish. By the end of the week, the nurses no longer flinched when the Americans laughed or played music near the wards. They began to understand that the American decadence was actually a form of resilience. The penicillin did more than cure infections. It acted as a solvent, dissolving the rigid, fear-based loyalty the nurses felt toward their fallen leaders. They were witnessing the triumph of a system that prioritized the repair of the human form over the preservation of a political myth. As they moved between the rows of cots, tending to both the victors and the vanquished with the same American silk and the same American medicine, the nurses were no longer just healing bodies. They were being purged of an ideology that had mistaken scarcity for strength and cruelty for conviction. The war of ideas was being won not by the loudest voice, but by the most effective medicine. The shift in the nurses' perspective reached its tipping point not through a grand speech, but through a quiet realization of systemic failure. This was the breaking of the old guard. Sister Martha, who had spent decades under the rigid hierarchy of the German medical establishment, began to see the cracks in the philosophy she had once considered unshakable. It happened during a late-shift inventory where she stood beside the American head nurse, a woman whose authority came from competence rather than fear. For years, Martha had been told that the German soldier was the most valuable asset of the state, yet she had watched those same soldiers be treated as expendable biological material when the supplies ran thin. In the American hospital, the philosophy was reversed. The individual was the center of the universe. She observed an American colonel, a man of high rank, stop to speak with a wounded private, offering him a stick of Wrigley's gum and a moment of genuine, horizontal human connection. There was no barking of orders, no demand for a salute from a man in a cast. The old guard of Martha's mind, the belief in the master race and the necessity of cold, Prussian discipline, was shattered by the sheer logic of American logistics. She realized that the war had been lost long before the first American tank crossed the Rhine. It had been lost in the factories, in the laboratories, and in a culture that saw a wounded soldier not as a broken tool, but as a person deserving of the finest silk and the most advanced medicine. The German state had asked for everything and provided nothing. The Americans asked for a job to be done and provided the world to do it. As she watched a younger German nurse, Elsa, laughing quietly with an American orderly over a shared chocolate bar, Martha felt a strange sense of relief. The burden of being superior was heavy, especially when it was built on a foundation of starvation and makeshift bandages. The breaking of her old ideology was not painful. It was a shedding of a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying. She looked at the crates of supplies, the mountains of gauze, the oceans of penicillin, the endless spools of silk, and saw them for what they truly were, the material evidence of a free society's power. The old guard had fallen, not to a superior sword, but to a superior way of valuing life. The war was over in her heart, replaced by a quiet, burgeoning respect for the decadent enemy who had proven to be more humane than the leaders she had served. The transition from the frantic pace of the surgical theater to the quietude of the night shifts and new truths allowed for a different kind of observation. Under the steady, unwavering glow of the American electric generators, the hospital took on a surreal, almost peaceful quality. The darkness of the German countryside was absolute, but the cathedral of canvas remained an island of light. Martha and the other nurses, no longer viewed as prisoners, but as essential colleagues, found themselves in the rare position of being able to reflect. The nights were filled with the low hum of conversation, not the sharp, barked commands of the Reich, but the melodic, rhythmic cadence of American English. Even without understanding every word, the nurses could hear the lack of fear in the voices. The Americans spoke of home, of cities like Chicago and New York, and of lives that were not defined by the looming shadow of a state. As they moved through the wards, checking pulses and adjusting blankets, the nurses saw the soldiers reading comic books or writing letters on high-quality, white paper, resources that were treated with the same casual abundance as the medical supplies. These new truths were solidified in the small details. Martha watched an American nurse discard a slightly bent safety pin and replace it with a new one from a box containing thousands. In Germany, that pin would have been straightened and reused until it snapped. This was the realization that the war was not just a conflict of armies, but a conflict of realities. The German reality was one of make do and hold the line, a desperate clinging to the past. The American reality was one of more and next, a relentless drive toward the future. The conversations between the nurses became more frequent in the quiet hours. Elsa confessed that she no longer felt like a prisoner, but like someone who had been rescued from a long, dark room. They discussed the American surgeons, men who worked until their eyes were bloodshot, but who still took the time to thank the nurses for a well-placed clamp. This was a radical departure from the German medical hierarchy, where the surgeon was a god and the nurse a mere servant. Here, the team was the unit of success. By the glow of the lanterns, Martha looked at her hands. They were clean, the skin no longer cracked by the harsh, abrasive lye soaps of the late war Reich. She felt the weight of the suture spool in her pocket, a small glass jar she had been given for her own kit. It was more than a medical tool. It was a physical piece of the truth. The Americans had not just won the war, they had invalidated the struggle that had preceded it. As the sun began to peek over the horizon, casting a pale light over the sprawling camp, the nurses realized that the darkness they had lived in for 12 years was finally lifting. They were no longer the old guard of a dying empire, but the first students of a new, more abundant world. The war did not end with a final explosion, but with a gradual silence that settled over the roar. As the news of the unconditional surrender filtered through the hospital radio sets, there were no triumphant parades within the canvas walls, only a shared, exhausted sense of relief. For Sister Martha and the German nurses, the unspooling thread of their experience had reached its conclusion. They stood at the edge of the camp, watching the first groups of healed prisoners, men they had sewn back together with American silk, being prepared for the long journey home. The recurring symbol of their transformation, the suture spool, now sat in Martha's palm as a souvenir of a world she had once feared. She looked at the fine, black thread and saw it no longer as a mere resource, but as a poetic reflection of the democratic ideal. The thread was strong because it was composed of many smaller strands woven together, much like the disparate people who made up the American army. It was abundant because the system that created it valued the repair of the broken over the glory of the break. The lesson they had learned in the Cathedral of Canvas was that freedom was not a luxury of the wealthy, but the engine that created the wealth in the first place. As the German nurses prepared to depart for their own civilian lives, the American major, Miller, approached them one last time. He did not offer a speech on the virtues of republic or the failures of fascism. Instead, he handed each woman a small wooden crate. Inside were basic medical supplies, sulfa packets, clean gauze, and several dozen jars of the black silk sutures. It was a parting gift that served as a seed for a new Germany. The Americans were not just leaving them with the memory of abundance. They were giving them the tools to rebuild their own shattered society on a foundation of individual care. The epilogue of their journey was written in the scars of the men they had treated. Those fine, dark lines, created with American silk and German skill, were the first stitches in the fabric of a new Europe. The experience had changed their perception of ideology forever. They had arrived as captives of a regime that worshipped strength and produced only ruins. They departed as witnesses to a civilization that worshipped life and produced an abundance so vast it could afford to heal its enemies. Martha looked back at the sprawling tent city one last time before the truck pulled away. The generators were still humming, a steady heartbeat of progress in a land that had forgotten how to hope. She realized then that the true victory of the Americans was not found in the caliber of their guns or the speed of their tanks, but in the simple, revolutionary act of teaching a defeated enemy how to suture. It was a truth that would outlast the ruins, that the greatest strength of a free people is their capacity to share their abundance, turning the threads of war into the cords of a lasting peace. The silk had held, the wound was closed, the future was ready to begin.